A Scottish town is rocked by the discovery of a body next to a burnt-out car.
They must have been in disbelief that something so horrific could have happened on their doorstep.
I thought it'd just been like another incident, as in an accident maybe, certainly not a murder.
But the brutality of the crime sets this case apart.
Never in 25 years have I seen such horrific injuries inflicted on somebody.
This violence is being perpetrated by somebody who enjoys violence.
The crime scene holds the secrets to the story.
Forensic evidence is a multitude of different strands all working together for one goal: to catch the killer.
It's the middle of summer. Emergency services respond to a 999 call in the Angus countryside. A nature reserve warden has reported a body by a burnt-out car. Forensic scientist Dr. Sarah Milne attends the scene.
We've been told there was the body of a deceased male, partially burnt, had been found beside a burnt-out vehicle at the Kinnordy Nature Reserve car park. So when we came down to the scene, what we had the burnt-out vehicle, which was pointed towards the entrance to the park, and at the front passenger side wheel of the vehicle was the body of the deceased. It looked like the body had purposely been laid next to the vehicle, and then the vehicle obviously set alight, and whether that had been in the hope that the body itself would have been consumed by the fire, but it certainly looked like the body had been placed close to the vehicle. Everything inside had been consumed by the fire, and then the fire had extended to the lower limbs of the deceased. From the initial assessment of the crime scene, it was quite obvious that this had been an attack by a person or persons, and that you were looking at a murder.
Once the scene is secured, CSIs examine the area.
A crime scene in a gravel car park with a car that's been set on fire, which is virtually burnt out, and a body underneath that car is potentially one of the worst kind of crime scenes that you could examine. You have the fact that there could be potential forensic evidence lost within the gravel on the car park. You got the fact that you're going to have to somehow remove the car from on top of the body without losing forensic evidence from that. Very difficult scene to examine.
But a closer look at the crime scene reveals further details.
Immediately around the body there was a lot of heavy contact staining, and also a run of blood, which is liquid blood. It's flowed due to gravity. And when we looked across to our left, it became evident that there was a drip trail of blood which travelled down the far edge of the car park, right up to where the two gates are at the car park entrance. It's quite a hard surface to look for blood, but we found a cluster of small spots in this area, small, very small spots, which is where you have force applied to wet blood, for example, from punching or kicking into wet blood. Just at this sort of grass verge at the entrance to the park, we also recovered a piece of apparent flesh from just on the roadside within that heavy blood staining. We had a particularly heavy area of contact blood staining on the road surface, which arced in an anti-clockwise direction, which continued on right up the centre of the park to where the body was found lying beside the vehicle. Once it was forensically recovered, the body was taken back to the Dundee mortuary.
The post-mortem reveals a multitude of injuries inflicted on the victim.
There was defensive wounds to both hands, and then numerous stab wounds to the torso and the left leg, which are likely the result of some sort of sharp-edged instrument such as a knife. There was also blunt force trauma to the brain, so striking to the head with an unknown object. There was severe injuries to the neck. One or two of the wounds inflicted had severed the spinal cord. This would have been with a long-bladed instrument such as perhaps a machete.
The cause of death is established as sharp force trauma to the neck from a bladed weapon. Professor Jim Fraser has over 40 years' experience in criminal investigations.
What interests me is why somebody gets into such a rage that they're willing to do this to somebody. Multiple injuries by multiple different means takes you into the point where there's either hate involved or rage involved, or this violence is being perpetrated by somebody who enjoys violence.
News of the horrific crime spreads across the tight-knit community of Kirriemuir.
Usually when you hear about murders, they occur in bigger cities. So when something like this happens in such a small town, I think it rocks the entire town just because it is so small and most people tend to know each other. They must have been in disbelief that something so horrific could have happened on their doorstep. You feel like you have quite a bit of pressure on you, particularly when you're doing the scene work.
The key question at the outset is going to be, who is this person? Who is this dead body? It's very difficult to investigate a crime until you know who the victim is. The victim will be at the centre of the investigation.
But later that day, a woman contacts the police to report her brother as missing. Stephen Donaldson, a 27-year-old oil rig worker from Arbroath. His colleague, Bruce Burney, recalls that day.
We both left to go away to work on the Monday morning. I was doing a 3-weeker or a 4-weeker. He was doing... We were going to be coming back roughly about the same time. He got fogged in, i.e. couldn't fly back. I got home. And that's when I got the phone call to see where he was. Was he with me or where was he? I thought he would have been at his girlfriend's, spending time with her. That's when I got a message saying that there'd been an incident at Kirriemuir and there was someone found there. I never took any heed or even dreamt that it would have been him. That was definitely not him.
Stephen's sister is asked to come to the mortuary for a formal identification. Tragically, she identifies the body as her brother, Stephen Donaldson.
I got the phone call saying it was him, still didn't believe it. Once you actually accept it was him, it was him. And then the anger. Why?
It's kind of almost impossible to know what happened at this crime scene. The only thing we can be sure about is that, there was a huge amount of violence.
But a closer look at the crime scene opens up a new line of inquiry.
That drag mark was from, two people carrying a person up the car park. This wasn't just one perpetrator.
A body found by a burnt-out car in the Angus countryside has been confirmed to be 27-year-old Stephen Donaldson. Blood patterns at the crime scene and post-mortem results indicate this was a prolonged and vicious attack.
We had potential for tyre marks, footwear marks, we had blood pattern to look at, recovery of the body. You're always kind of thinking ahead of yourself as to what best can we do to try and maximise the recovery, because ultimately you could provide that missing piece in this investigation that could, really take this case forward. Nobody knew what had happened that day. The police obviously had a lot of work to do around CCTV, any eyewitness statements, just to try and build up a picture of whether MD had seen anything that might lead them, towards the perpetrators.
As the police investigation ramps up, Stephen's family and friends try to come to terms with the devastating news.
We're all talking about, well, our mate's gone. And his sisters and his mum and dad and the hurt and the question why, and yeah. We were just kind of all stuck together to see if we could suss it out between us, but obviously we couldn't.
As the news continues to spread, family and friends are confronted with rumours surrounding their loved one.
We were all talking to each other, see what was going on. You heard that he was involved in drugs and he was involved in selling dodgy motors and stuff like that, and it was just all bullshit, you know what I mean? Because there was nothing dodgy about him, just the boy liked motors and cars and his life. But yeah, the drug talk and all that, well, I suppose that's just the mentality of some people, small town, nice car, nice bike. I can see where they're coming for that, but you've also got to remember he's a hard-working man. I didn't know anybody that didn't like him.
I heard about Stephen Donaldson. He was a very successful offshore oil worker. He had, I believe it was 3 properties, rental properties, that he owned and rented out. He enjoyed his cars, and I believe he enjoyed his motorbikes also. And that just when he was onshore, he enjoyed going out in the car or the motorbike, and had really quite a successful career and, a good lifestyle.
Please speak to Stephen's family and friends to understand any key moments in his life leading up to his murder.
Well, Stevie come bouncing as normal, wanting to get the kettle on, etc. And I was sitting there, and he just went, "You'll not believe this, Brucey, you'll not believe this." I was like, "What is it?" And he's like, "I think I'm waiting with your dad. I can't believe it." I was like, "Well, these things happen, Steve. What am I going to do? There's just not much more you can do about it, is there, really?" He would have been a good dad, that's for sure. The bairn would have been totally spoilt, 2 bits, motorbikes, whatever the bairn wanted, it would have got.
There is a key development in the case. Stephen's ex-girlfriend, an expectant mother of his child, 19-year-old Tasmin Glass, contacts the police with information.
I believe there was communication between his sister and Tasmin Glass, and that following that, Tasmin Glass made herself known to police to state that she was in an on-off relationship with the deceased.
A popular local singer, Tasmin had been dating Stephen since June 2017. She tells police that she and Stephen had split up 2 months ago, and they had arranged to meet on the night of his murder to see if they could get back together and raise their child.
She stated she had meant to meet him the night prior up at what is known as Kerry Hill or the Peter Pan Park, but that Stephen Donaldson hadn't turned up. Therefore, she left the park and she went home.
Tasmin is invited to the police station to help police with their inquiries.
She gave a statement, agreed to give her clothing, her phone, and have nail samples taken, and she was treated as a witness.
While Tasmin helps police at the station, detectives try and hypothesise what could have taken place at the crime scene.
Where has the victim come from? The victim somehow must have got underneath that car. So has the victim been taken somewhere before the crime and then taken to that location?
I think the blood pattern that we saw and what we could infer from that was my opinion that he had potentially been assaulted as he exited the vehicle, or at that point he was bleeding from an injury because you had spots and stains. He then travelled the length of the car park towards the car park entrance. He then sustained quite a heavy assault at the car park entrance before being subsequently dragged back up. Potentially it was here where the final blows were inflicted. Had there been only one person dragging that body by either the hands or the feet, then we were all of the opinion that you would have seen other drag marks made by dragging heels or hands.
The drag mark indicates to the police there could have been more than one person involved in the crime.
Therefore, given it was just one single uniform drag mark, we all formed the opinion that there was two people, one at the hands and one at the feet, dragging the body back up.
And a closer inspection of the gravel reveals another mark.
It was this distinct single tyre mark, which led the roads police to form the opinion this was from a motorcycle, which appeared to accelerate across the drag mark heading towards the car park entrance.
Back at the police station, Tasmin Glass gives a more detailed statement about the night before her ex, Stephen Donaldson, was found dead. She states that she'd been in the company of her current boyfriend, Stevie Dickey, as well as Callum Davidson and his girlfriend.
Davidson and Dickey are known locally as minor criminals, and the police would want to eliminate them from any investigation, so the next step would be to interview them. A standard method of investigating homicide is to use what the police call TIE, trace, interview, eliminate. This is based on the idea that our daily steps can be reconstructed simply by interviewing people that are connected with us. As a consequence of these interviews, although Dickey and Davidson denied any involvement in the incident, they volunteered to provide their phones and have their hands swabbed for forensic tests.
They provided an elimination DNA sample. Because they were witnesses, they offered up their DNA for us to use in the investigation. So we had a reference sample from them, which we can then use for comparison when we're looking at our crime stain samples.
The four witnesses tell police that they went swimming together on the evening of the 6th of June. Then as Tasmin went to the Peter Pan Park for the arranged meet-up with Stephen Donaldson, the other three say they went back to Davidson's home in Kirriemuir.
I think Callum Davidson was in his house watching Family Guy and that he'd never actually left the house. Stephen Dickey, he was present in the address as well, which I think was quite common for him to stay over at the address, so I think they both had put themselves together that evening.
However, Davidson's girlfriend tells police a different version of events from that evening.
I understand that there was discrepancies, I think, between the statements provided. Callum Davidson's girlfriend had said that he had gone out with Stephen Dickey and that they had returned sometime later and then gone and taken a shower.
The contradicting statements cause concern, and police recover CCTV evidence from the night in question.
There's no CCTV, as far as I'm aware, up at the Peter Pan car park or Kinordie Nature Reserve. There was just CCTV from in and around Kirriemuir that showed Tasmin Glass's vehicle.
Tasmin's car is seen on CCTV at around 10:45 p.m, heading in the direction of the Peter Pan Park, which matches with her statement. However, Stephen Donaldson's white BMW is also seen on CCTV around the same time, heading in the same direction. And an eyewitness near the play park comes forward.
If you've got eyewitnesses, frankly, you don't need the CCTV. The eyewitnesses, for me, are more important, particularly if they are independent eyewitnesses.
One eyewitness spoke to being at the park and seeing Tasmin Glass drive up.
The eyewitness says Tasmin was not alone in her car. They tell police they also saw Davidson in the passenger seat, as well as Dickey alongside on his motorbike.
The crucial thing about the eyewitness evidence is that it puts these three individuals together at the Peter Pan car park at a time that is within a few hours of the burnt-out car and the body being found. The question, of course, is, did something happen there?
But another eyewitness tells police they saw Tasmin's car parked near a white BMW matching the description of Stephen Donaldson's vehicle. They then state that the BMW only stayed in the car park for a few minutes before speeding off.
With the eyewitness statements, placing them at the park, with CCTV showing direction of travel and where cars had been in the town, I think that built up a picture of, heading up to the park, the meeting that happened, and then obviously the driving of Stephen Donaldson's vehicle to the nature reserve.
These accounts indicate that there are also discrepancies in Tasman Glass's statement to the police.
We were informed that Tasman Glass, Stephen Dickey and Callum Davidson had now become officially accused persons. You obviously now have potentially 3 accused, however, you still have to do all your examinations, to see if that can shed any further light, give you any forensic link to these persons.
With Tasman Glass, Stevie Dickey and Callum Davidson all being connected to where the victim's car was last seen, the Peter Pan car park becomes a crime scene, and all 3 are arrested on suspicion of Stephen Donaldson's murder.
Must have been in the papers or online, but I didn't know. I didn't know the guys. I certainly knew Stevie, wouldn't have known those names. So, disbelief of his girlfriend being involved. Maybe the 2 guys, but no her. I didn't think she'd be involved in it.
3 suspects are now in custody, but police continue to search for incriminating evidence, including the murder weapon.
We know that Donaldson has blunt force injuries, and a baseball bat can cause blunt force trauma. If she drives Davidson back to pick up a baseball bat, what was going on there? What did she think he was going to do with the baseball bat?
Police investigating the murder of 27-year-old Stephen Donaldson in Kirriemuir have arrested 3 people. His ex-girlfriend, Tasman Glass, her new boyfriend, Stevie Dickey, and his friend, Callum Davidson. After conflicting witness statements, CCTV and eyewitnesses placed them all at the Peter Pan Park, where the victim's white BMW was last seen, before heading in the direction of the Kinnordy Nature Reserve.
This was an unusual murder. There's 3 people involved. Murders of this type are quite rare. At the centre of this, the motivation is complex.
Because Tasman was once in a relationship with Stephen, it could be that Stevie Dickey became extremely jealous, knowing that Tasman was pregnant with Stephen's child. It's likely that he saw Stephen as a threat.
He's to some extent involved in a love triangle. His motivation might be sexual jealousy, it might be revenge, it might be that he simply thinks that violence is the solution to any problem, and the way out of this problem is to kill Donaldson. Motivation of Davidson's more difficult to identify. There are no obvious clear pointers to me, but he obviously was a close friend of Dickey. You can only speculate about motivation, of course.
While the suspects are interviewed in custody, CSIs examining the Peter Pan Park struggle to harvest any forensic evidence, which indicates to police that the initial assault of Stephen likely took place inside his car, and may explain why Stephen's white BMW was seen speeding towards the nature reserve.
It's kind of almost impossible to know what happened at this crime scene. The only thing we can be sure about is that, there was a huge amount of violence that wasn't necessary just to render the victim unconscious. It went way beyond that.
With the cause of death established as deep wounds to the neck from a sharp-bladed instrument, police teams at the nature reserve expand their search for the weapon to the surrounding areas.
Although there was a great deal of evidence, there was plainly some key evidence missing. The weapons had never been found. The SIO then asked a police search team to go back and research the scene.
As you drive down towards the nature reserve, the grass verges were you know, very thick with vegetation. It was obviously June, we'd had warm, wet weather, we were completely overgrown. So systematically, I think the police were doing a search, strimming back and thoroughly going through the grass verge.
These are specially trained officers who will search and find absolutely anything that's incriminating. And they then uncovered the baseball bat.
A baseball bat handle was found within the grass verge, just almost across from the entrance to the nature reserve.
We know that Donaldson has blunt force injuries, and a baseball bat can cause blunt force trauma.
The specialist search team continues to comb through the area.
There is a field just adjacent to that grass verge that there was a splinter of wood recovered on the same day. When they were examined together, they looked like they could have formed one item, like an intact baseball bat.
The items are recovered and taken to the lab for forensic testing. Detectives at the police station continue to interview the suspects, and Tasmin Glass discloses that she and Stephen Donaldson had not only organised to meet that night to discuss their relationship, but that she owed him £1,000 from a car insurance payoff.
Glass was in debt to Donaldson, so it may be that either she felt that Dickie could somehow resolve this debt by meeting Donaldson, or it was Dickie's idea that he would do her some kind of favour and help resolve this debt by meeting Donaldson.
While the interviewing of the suspects continues, police recover further CCTV footage.
In the early hours of the 7th of June, CCTV showed Callum Davidson riding a push bike around Kirriemuir town centre.
Most people don't go out cycling in the early hours of the morning. Davidson would have to have some kind of reasonable explanation for that.
The CCTV appears to show Davidson riding his bike in the direction of the Kinaldie Nature Reserve. And police use data from his mobile phone to track his movements.
The key thing about phones is that they are almost literally tracking devices. The phone tracks you via cell site triangulation because it picks up signals. Some apps in phones follow your geographic location.
Davidson's phone showed it travelled a distance of around 1 kilometre north, between 1:20 and 1:40 a.m, which further disproves his statement that he never left his home at Marywell Bray that evening. Detectives hypothesised Davidson's motivation for heading back towards the nature reserve.
There's a chance that the offender may have entered into a state of panic and anxiety, knowing that they'd left something at the crime scene.
Officers searched Davidson's address for the bicycle seen on CCTV.
There was a push bike being stored in what was the spare bedroom of the house. Given that obviously Callum Davidson had been seen on CCTV riding a bicycle, I then carried out an investigation of the bike. When I swabbed the two handlebars, I was getting a chemical test indicative of the presence of blood. These swabs were subsequently analysed back at the lab, and they gave us a mixed DNA profile with DNA that could be attributable to Callum Davidson and Stephen Donaldson. We'd done so much work and turned up nothing that when we got this, it was a bit of a sort of golden nugget moment in that, you know, you now have this transfer that's got to be explained. You know, why was there Stephen Donaldson's DNA that could be attributed to him on the handlebars? We now had some kind of information that could take the investigation forward.
Police suspect there could be further trace evidence of the victim's blood on other items belonging to the suspect.
I haven't seen the injuries to the deceased. In my opinion, the perpetrators at the time would have had a considerable amount of blood on them.
A key bit of detail emerges from Davidson's girlfriend's statement about the night in question.
She made a statement to police that both males had a shower, and when she came home later on the evening following the incident, there appeared to be these items of clothing that had gone through a wash cycle, which instantly diminishes the potential for us to get something of forensic value.
The washing machine itself also becomes a point of interest for forensic evidence. If clothing has been heavily bloodstained, there is the potential to be able to find blood traces in the drum of the washing machine, but also around the front seal of the washing machine or in the waste pipe. All these areas will be swabbed and searched to see if there's any traces of blood.
Examination of the washing machine fails to produce any evidence. But an unwashed T-shirt belonging to Davidson does contain forensic value.
Straight away we found some small spots and stains, and there was just sort of one contact stain on the front of the T-shirt. We took a bit of blood off the front of the T-shirt that matched Callum Davidson himself, but we took a small spot of blood on the very lower back of the T-shirt. And when we analysed this small spot of blood, it matched the DNA profile of Stephen Donaldson. When we talk about a small spot of blood, it's blood that's been subjected to a force that causes the blood to break up into small spots that travel through the air. It means that T-shirt was within 1 to 2 metres of the source of the wet blood when there was that impact. It doesn't necessarily implicate him that he specifically struck Stephen Donaldson, but it does put him in the vicinity. Why this T-shirt was not put into the washing machine, the only thing I can think is that he thought as an undergarment that it was concealed, it was covered over, and therefore didn't feel the need to have that item laundered.
So that was Donaldson's blood on Davidson when Davidson was very close to Donaldson bleeding, putting him at the crime scene.
Results from the baseball bat return from the lab.
There was blood found on both the splinter of wood and the baseball bat, which matched the DNA profile of Stephen Donaldson. When we did the examination in the lab on the baseball bat handle, there was a fingerprint identified in blood, and I understand that fingerprint matched a fingerprint of Callum Davidson.
The fingerprint on the handle obviously suggests that Davidson has handled the bat, and the link to Donaldson, of course, his blood is very incriminating.
The forensic evidence on the 3 items indicates that Davidson was directly involved in the attack on Stephen. But it isn't clear if he committed the fatal blow using the undiscovered sharp-bladed instrument. Police need to also connect Dickie to the crime scene.
Because at that point there was the mention of this motorcycle mark through the drag mark, the decision was taken to obtain warrants so we could examine Stephen Dickie's home address where he primarily resided. There was 2 motorcycles in a shed at the back of the garden, but we found nothing of significance on the motorcycles. When we examined the house, that address didn't yield anything of forensic value in the case.
Despite the lack of physical evidence placing Dickie at the crime scene, his digital phone data is tracked, moving towards the direction of the nature reserve. Just after 11 p.m, and additional data is provided from the device's health app.
Some apps track all sorts of other things, like fitness apps can track things like, number of steps you've taken, distance travelled, and all of these things are timed. So by using that data, you can reconstruct somebody's movement. It was established from analysis of his mobile phone that he was in town that evening, and later on he was at Kinnordy.
Around the time of the initial assault on Stephen Donaldson at the Peter Pan Park, Dickie's health app recorded an elevation gain of 416 metres in just 9 minutes. Then an hour later, between 12:15 and 12:45 a.m, the app recorded a walking distance of 3.9 kilometres in 47 minutes, which leaves detectives to suspect this was Dickie travelling by foot from the nature reserve back to Kirriemuir.
Analysis of the health app data obviously tended to contradict what the accused had initially been saying about them being within Callum Davidson's house. It showed that certainly the phones had been out moving about. It's my belief that they probably didn't realise there was that information stored on the phone.
But police still need to determine Tasmin Glass's involvement. As the custody interviews continue, She admits to meeting Stephen at the play park, but states she would never have done so if she knew it would have led to murder.
I'm trying to imagine the kind of psychology of Glass here. She may or may not have wanted this to happen. She obviously wanted something to happen to Donaldson, but it may not have been him to be killed.
An eyewitness comes forward, Davidson's uncle, who reveals that the day before the murder, his nephew came to collect a baseball bat from him and was accompanied by Tasmin Glass.
If she drives Davidson back to his uncle's so Davidson can pick up a baseball bat, what was going on there? What did she think he was going to do with the baseball bat?
It appears that Tasmin is calculating and has planned for this scenario. It seems clear that Tasmin wanted Stephen to get hurt.
Text messages sent to Stephen from Glass's phone are retrieved by the digital forensic team, and they arouse suspicion.
She sent a text message to pretend that she actually was worried about him. You are left with the impression that she knew that he was missing. You might think she wanted to somehow distance herself from the murder. I think she's trying to cover her tracks.
Police have gathered together several strands of evidence to charge all three individuals with murder.
There is no smoking gun. It's very rare that there's like one piece of evidence which is the one that sends somebody down.
Police investigating the killing of oil rig worker Stephen Donaldson have charged Tasmin Glass, Stevie Dickey and Callum Davidson in connection with this murder. Forensics, digital data and eyewitness statements indicate they were all directly involved in the crime. All three plead not guilty and they await trial.
My whole intention was to go to the whole thing and try and understand why.
The trial into the murder of Stephen Donaldson begins, and Bruce Burney recalls seeing his friend's alleged attackers in the dock.
There were just three different people come walking in, and that was the three people that did the damage. I was just annoyed when I seen them. Do you know what I mean?
As the trial gets underway, details of the post-mortem injuries are revealed to the court.
When I heard of his injuries, it was shocking, you know, absolute shocking. And the way I tried to get away. Steve Bill looked after himself. Yeah, he was a strong, fit man. But against that, no. How cruel can people be to each other? For what?
One of the characteristic features of psychopathy is lack of empathy to other people. In other words, people are just means to an end. One or both of them completely lost the plot by the sounds of it.
Despite the sharp-bladed murder weapon having never been found, the prosecution present a plethora of incriminating evidence to the court.
They've marshalled multiple sources of evidence to reconstruct this. If you put the whole investigation together by the police in something like the space of 8 or 10 days, it's quite impressive how quickly they built a strong case against them.
But the most compelling evidence lies with the forensics.
So the three pieces were finding DNA attributable to Stephen Donaldson on the handlebars of Callum Davidson's bike, the small spot of blood that we found on the Callum Davidson's shirt that matched Stephen Donaldson's profile, and the baseball bat which had Stephen Donaldson's blood, and a fingerprint that matched Callum Davidson's fingerprint.
It's very, very rare that you're going to get forensic evidence that says that guy is the murderer. You get a fingerprint in the victim's blood on the murder weapon. You know, that kind of like just big arrows.
Our expectations from the start were quite low, just given the potential for sort of people to have showered, got rid of evidence, washed clothing. So to be able to just find those three small pieces of information, which together with everything else painted quite a good picture of what had gone on that night.
The forensics are damning for Callum Davidson. But it's the digital phone data, in particular the health app, that places Stevie Dickey at the crime scene.
From what I understand, this was the first time that this health app information had been used, certainly in a Scottish court, in a trial such as this, and I think it was quite key in that it showed movement at the time that both Stephen Dickey and Callum Davidson had said they were at home.
It is a misconception in fiction that there is a single piece of killer evidence. That does happen. It's pretty rare. Most cases, people are convicted on a package of evidence. Some of it direct, some of it indirect, some of it circumstantial. It's very rare that there's like one piece of evidence which is the one that sends somebody down.
With the mountain of evidence placing both men at the crime scene, they quickly turn on each other.
In this instance, we've got 3 people involved in the case. We've got Glass, who denies any involvement in the murder and distances herself from the murder. And we've got Davidson and Dickey, who were plainly involved in the murder on the basis of the evidence that we know, but they incriminated and blamed each other. Each of them is giving an account. Each of those accounts is different, and both of them are getting into the witness box. You've then got a smart prosecution lawyer that can cross-examine you and trip you up and find out all sorts of things that you really don't want to talk about.
Dickey had intimated that he'd gone with Callum Davidson up towards the park, but he'd held back, and that had been Callum Davidson that had initiated the assault on Stephen Donaldson. Regarding Callum Davidson's side of the story, he made it his position that it was Stephen Dickey that had obviously carried out the assault.
Having other suspects implicated in the crime gives an outlet to push the onus onto somebody else and indicate that you weren't the primary offender. In this way, offenders could convince themselves that they didn't play a key part in the crime.
Sometimes when you've got 2 people who are incriminating each other, it actually ends up being worse for both of them.
After a 22-day trial, the jury return with a verdict. Stevie Dickey and Callum Davidson are both found guilty of murder. Dickey is sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years. Davidson is sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years.
In this case, it's quite clear that the jury were convinced that these individuals were guilty beyond reasonable doubt.
Callum Davidson had more convictions of a serious nature against him. The judge was of the belief that Callum Davidson perhaps was more of an aggressor in the assault, and therefore he was given a slightly longer sentence.
With a wealth of evidence proving that she was the instigator behind the crime, but was not involved in the violence itself, Tasmin Glass is found guilty of culpable homicide, the Scottish equivalent to manslaughter. She is sentenced to 10 years in prison.
The fact that Glass was convicted of culpable homicide kind of disrupts my thinking. So it may be that she lured him there and plainly knew what was going on. I would have thought they would all be convicted of murder. All of them were acting what they call in England in concert and what they call in Scotland art and parts. In other words, each of them was playing a part in this series of events that led to a criminal homicide.
And even with Stephen's killers behind bars, nothing will bring back the ambitious young man who had his whole life ahead of him.
You've got to stop sussing out why and stop trying to figure it out, because you ain't never going to figure it out and you're wasting all your time. Yeah, nothing's going to bring him back, is it? Nothing. Yeah, the world's a lot sadder place without him here. And it's just such a waste. What a waste. I feel so sorry for his family. Not his mate, not his mum or his dad or his sister. It was terrible. Terrible.